Just once again, click on resubmit if you haven't already. In the text box, type 3 significant things. So today we'll discuss leadership in the United States. And we'll focus mostly on the presidents because they get most of the attention, but obviously we have leadership that occurs at all three levels: the presidency, which also includes in the executive branch at the national level, the cabinet secretaries, which lead their departments, and then in each of the states, the governors, obviously. And then at the local level, we have county commissioners and township supervisors and school board directors and mayors and borough and city council. So leadership comes in all forms, and it also is in our own lives at the businesses that we work at, the organizations we're involved with, and so on. But we'll look at mostly just the presidency here. And let's start with the first leader, George Washington. And George Washington is a good example of an unassuming, modest leader. Here is a man who led the United States Continental Army, defeating the superpower of the world, Britain. Albeit he did it by only winning 3 battles. He lost all the other ones. But he won the important ones, and he could have easily been just named the leader of the country without a lot of dispute from the people. He was overwhelmingly popular, and it was basically expected that he would become the leader of the country. In fact, the presidency, when it was debated at the Constitutional Convention, was modeled around him to a great extent. And he was an unassuming politician because he really wasn't too involved in politics. He had been chosen, for instance, as a delegate to go to the convention and was actually chosen as the president of the convention, but he mostly kept order and sat back and didn't get involved in too many of the arguments. So he himself knew that he was limited to his experience with being a military officer, with being a land surveyor, a plantation owner, and his favorite hobby of breeding donkeys. So these things didn't exactly match up to be the chief executive of a country. So when he did get chosen by the Electoral College to be the first president, he knew that he needed a team of people, cabinet secretaries, that had a wide range of experience, especially when it came to governing and politics. And it included people with different opinions about the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, was more of a loose constructionist, believing that the Constitution was just a guide, while people like Thomas Jefferson, who actually wasn't involved in the Constitution, he was out of the country as an ambassador at the time, he believed the Constitution should be followed strictly word for word. So he knew that it was important to hear different opinions. And so in that way, we say that he was more of a democratic leader. And when we use democratic in this sense, we mean that he wants to foster different opinions and hear from different people and let them lead in their own way. He was also what we refer to as more of a passive leader. Even though he would make decisions, he wanted to hear all this debate, and usually whatever type of argument won out is what decision that he would go with. And so he was more laid back and delegated authority in many cases, with the exception of a few instances like the Whiskey Rebellion, when he was willing to personally lead the military out to Western Pennsylvania to crush it. So in that sense, he was more passive. And he was also more of a negative president, not that he was a president that demeaned the office or anything like that. That's not what that means. What it means is that he accepted it out of civic responsibility. He was not someone that sought the limelight. He didn't like big fancy ceremonies. He was more of an introverted person. And so really the office and all of its pomp and circumstance and fanciness wasn't necessarily his cup of tea, but he decided to do it anyway out of civic duty for his country. And so in that sense, he was more passive. Let's fast forward to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was supposed to be the president, but no one got the electoral majority the first time he ran, so the House chose John Quincy Adams instead. So Jackson spent most of those 4 years bad-mouthing Adams and building what would be known as the Democratic Party, the first formal political party in the world that had employees and volunteers and propaganda, because he wanted to make sure that he won the presidency 4 years later, and he did. And he became a major partisan opponent of the Whigs that backed nationalist projects, building roads, bridges, canals, having a central bank, because they thought it was necessary for the economy. He was convinced all of this stuff just favored the rich, and it does favor the rich because the rich have lots of money and it's going to make them more money. And believing that it only favored the rich, though, he ended up vetoing more legislation than all previous presidents combined. He was ultimately a decision maker and was more of an active president. He didn't necessarily listen to his cabinets. He even had a special group of advisors made up of his closest friends that were known as the kitchen cabinet because he kind of met with them on the side. And he ultimately embodied this active, powerful presidency, really the first one that we would have to that extent, with maybe the exception of Washington. And we wouldn't have again a lot throughout most of the 19th century. Then there's Ulysses S. Grant. Now, you might think, oh, he must be a lot like Washington. Well, he really didn't want to be president at all. So he's at the extreme end of the negative sort of leadership. He really only accepted it because people begged and begged and begged him to run for president of the United States, based on his role as a Civil War general. He also did not want to participate in the governing, and so to even greater extent than Washington, he was a passive president, really letting his cabinet do whatever they wanted, including pilfering money from the taxpayers, especially his Secretary of the Interior, making land oil deals with private companies, getting bribes in return, or even shares of the money that was being made. And it also includes some of his own personal staff. Grant avoided being in the White House as much as possible. And despite all this, he ended up being begged to run for a second term, and he was popular enough still from the Civil War that he won re-election pretty easily. But this passivity and negativity, of course, ended up meaning that in the historical rankings, Grant typically is pretty low. Now, some of that has to do with the Civil War because Southern historians afterwards did as much as they could to write books about how terrible he was. But some of it is also based on the inefficiencies and weaknesses of his presidency. But let's talk about two positive, active presidents, Teddy Roosevelt and his cousin, distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Both of these men embodied the happy type of warrior, the happy leader that was glad to enact legislation and sign off on it and sponsor it and push it through Congress on behalf of the American people. With Teddy Roosevelt, it was things like the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, antitrust laws. With FDR, it was the New Deal. And both of them, of course, loved the pomp and circumstance, the attention that they got. Teddy Roosevelt in particular was thrilled with it. And they embodied, of course, a leader that was kind of a model for the country that made the presidency look like it was the ultimate pinnacle of power in the government. Before that, really Congress was the one who had the say in most things. But now the people's attention started to focus more toward the presidency, especially by the time FDR was in office, because he used the advent of radio to kind of transmit himself into all or as many American households as possible. If Teddy Roosevelt had had the radio, he would have done even more with it probably. And he would have been amazed with TV, in particular, if everyone got to see his face all the time. So both of these people, of course, also were more, Teddy Roosevelt was more of an authoritarian with his leadership style. I mentioned that Washington was more democratic. Teddy Roosevelt is really going to have the final say on things and is also going to be very active in the sense that he was involved in information gathering. He liked to learn quite a bit and experience things in person in the field, go out and talk to people. And so he was also at the extreme end of activity as well. Next one I want to mention is Ronald Reagan. You might think, is it possible to be a passive president and to be good at president at the same time in the modern age? We saw Washington got away with it. Can you as well in the modern times with TV and people always watching you and so on? And the answer is yes, and Ronald Reagan is a good example of that. Ronald Reagan, even though he was the governor of California before the presidency, other than that, he didn't have a lot of political experience. In fact, he had been an actor. And so he did not know a lot about necessarily even the military because during World War II, he served in the reserves making films for the Army. So it's not like he had a lot of combat experience or anything. So he also pulled together a cabinet of well-experienced Republicans in particular to help him run the government on a day-to-day basis. And being an actor, he knew how to get onto TV. And even though he had kind of an adversarial relationship with the press like President Trump does, he was able to use it to his advantage. and was often the center of attention. And he would use his good humor, for instance, to diffuse tense situations with the Democrats in Congress or a tough question from journalists. He would even joke around with Mikhail Gorbachev, the head of the Soviet Union. And so this kind of happy type of status and the fact that he was always on TV made him seem like he was always in charge and making decisions. But behind the scenes, that wasn't the case. Usually he would delegate authority. There's a famous case of once when there was an incident involving one of our fighter pilots around the world, and they called him at 3 a.m. and to wake him up about it. And he asked, well, is the guy okay? Did everything work out? And they said, yes. And he said, well, please don't bother me with something like this again. So he wasn't necessarily concerned about micromanaging or being involved on a daily basis. But despite all that, because of the image of his involvement, that made him seem like an active president when actually he was more of a passive one. But of course, going along with that, he was also a positive president. He greatly enjoyed the pomp and circumstance. Being from Hollywood, he was used to wearing a tux all the time. So that really didn't harm him at all. And the last one I mentioned was George H.W. Bush. This is Bush the Elder. He's one of the people who has had probably the most experience ever before he became president of the United States. He had served in Congress. He had been part of the cabinet before. He had been an ambassador. He had been head of the CIA. And so he had an enormous amount of experience even before he became vice president under Reagan. And then he got elected in his own right, basically looked at as the third term of Reagan. Reagan was so popular, his vice president got elected. H.W. Bush, though, is not much of a people person. He is more of a bookworm, what's called a policy wonk. He likes the detail. He likes researching and reading. He doesn't really like getting involved too much in things like campaigning. There was a scene when he was up for re-election against Bill Clinton, and the independent candidate Ross Perot was a town hall with people asking questions. And I was only like several minutes into the debate, and the camera caught him looking at his watch, like, oh, I can't wait to get out of here. So that kind of doomed him for his re-election because obviously his heart wasn't in it. But behind the scenes, he was incredibly active. He was heavily involved. Like I said, he loved the information. He liked to learn about things. He liked to make decisions based on what he learned. And so to the public, he seemed like a passive person, but in reality, he was much more active than Ronald Reagan. And unfortunately, the imagery ended up dooming him in the long run because he was not reelected, being replaced by a hick Southern governor. Yes?
I saw an article where it said Biden checked his watch in the debate, too. Is that...
That might have happened, yes. I don't know if he would get punished as much for that. The particular thing was it was during a town hall, and an average person was asking a question. And so it depends on the situation. So yes, that might be possible. Would it hurt him as much? I don't think so, especially during the first debate, since people were traumatized by that one.
I think it was just in the most recent one.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't think in this case. If it would have been a town hall, yes. But not so much if it's just the moderator there. Because one of the things they had to do, obviously, to get it more orderly was they had to get their answers done with a certain amount of time. So that might have been what he was doing. Or at least that's what his campaign would probably explain.